Before the sun touched the ridgeline, before the first rooster called across Elorn, Basin Birch Coltrane stood alone in the dark and pressed his palm flat against a wall of stone. The fire inside the lime kiln had died the night before. He had banked it himself around sundown, raked the coals flat, and walked back to the bunkhouse without looking back. That was years before Wyoming, years before Winifred, years before the children. He was a younger man than working the dry foothills farther south, building, retaining walls, and firing lime for men who paid in coin and asked no questions. He had not planned to be awake before dawn. He simply was. And something brought him back to the kiln in the darkness, some habit of the hands that did not need reason to move. The stone beneath his palm was warm, not the warmth of a fire burning close, not the warmth of sunlight on a summer afternoon. Something quieter than either of those things. The fire had been out for nearly 10 hours. The air around him was cold enough to show his breath, and yet the wall held something, a trace, a memory of heat that had soaked inward through the long hours of burning and had not yet finished giving itself back. Birch stood there for a long time. He was not a man who read books about such things. He had no language for what he was feeling. He only understood it the way a man understands something his hands learn before his mind does. Stone did not behave the way people assumed. It did not simply store cold and steal warmth from whatever touched it. Given time, given the right conditions, it did the opposite. It received heat, slowly held it deep, and released it slowly again. Long after the fire was gone, long after most men had stopped expecting anything from it, he took his hand away, looked at his palm in the darkness, put it back against the stone. Still warm. From that morning forward, Birch Coltrane looked at every wall differently. He noticed things other workers did not notice. He noticed that the western face of a stone barn stayed warmer longer into the evening than its eastern face. He noticed that a thick-walled root cellar never froze even in weeks when the surface ground turned iron hard. He noticed that the boss on a property always chose to sleep against the stone foundation of a building rather than beside a wooden fence, even when the two were the same distance from the house. He never said much about any of it. The work was the work. You built what the man paid you to build. You moved on to the next job when it was done. But the knowledge stayed with him, patient and quiet, waiting for the moment it would be useful. That moment came in the winter of 1883, inside a cabin he had built himself with his own hands. Elorn Basin, Wyoming territory. The basin sat between two long ridges that funneled the north wind straight down the valley floor every time a front came through from Canada. Settlers who had wintered there before knew to expect it. Settlers who had not tended to find out the hard way. Birch had arrived the spring before with Winifred and the two children, Roscoe, who was 12, and Nettie, who was 9. He had used what money he had to buy a quarter section of decent grassland near Windahome Creek and had spent the summer building the cabin that most men in the basin would have recognized as adequate. Green-cut pine logs dovetailed at the corners, a good tight roof with enough pitch to shed snow, a cast-iron stove centered on the east wall. He had done it right by every standard he knew. He had done it the way men in that country built. January arrived and the cabin showed him what those standards were worth. The wind found the gaps between the boards on the coldest nights, slipping through in thin streams that cut across the floor at ankle height. Winifred spent hours on her knees pushing twisted rags and dried grass into every opening she could reach, working by lamplight while the children slept. A few days later, she would start over in different places because the cold always found another path. The house was not poorly built. It was built from the wrong material for what winter asked of it. Wood that had dried and contracted through the summer left hairline gaps the eye could barely see, and the cold could walk straight through. The stove worked without rest. Birch fed it through the night, waking every hour or two to add wood, listening for the particular sound the metal made when the fire was getting low. Even with the stove running hard, the warmth never distributed itself evenly. The center of the room close to the iron stayed bearable, but a wooden bucket set near the far wall often carried a thin skin of ice before dawn. Nettie slept in her coat most nights. Roscoe had learned to curl himself around the heat of his own body and not move until morning. Gravel understood the problem better than any of them. The dog, a thick-coated animal that ran mostly black with a gray muzzle, spent every night pressed against the side of the stove, sometimes so close that Birch could smell singed fur when he came down to add wood. The dog did not choose that spot because it was comfortable. It chose it because Everything else was worse. What stayed with Birch most was not the cold itself, it was Winifred. She did not complain. That was the thing he could not put down. She did not blame the cabin, or blame him, or make any sound at all that suggested she expected something different. She simply worked. She stuffed the gaps. She rationed the firewood. She got up before the children each morning to have the stove going before they came down so they would not feel the worst of it. She did all of this without a word of complaint, and somehow that silence cost him more than any accusation could have. One night near the end of January, their neighbor, Marvella Alcott, knocked at the door just before midnight. Marvella was a widow of 50 who lived on the next claim east, a capable woman who had survived 3 Wyoming winters already without help from anyone. Birch opened the door and she stood there with her coat pulled tight and her breath coming in short white bursts. Her stove had gone out, she had no more coals to restart it, and her woodpile was frozen solid to the ground. Birch gave her the last of the live coals from the bottom of the stove, shoveled into an old cast iron pot she carried. She thanked him and walked back through the dark. He closed the door and turned around. Winifred was sitting in her chair by the wall where she had been mending a shirt. She looked at him once and looked back down at her work. She did not say a word. The next morning, she rebuilt the fire from scratch using green wood that sat in the cold, and the sound it made, that wet, reluctant crackling of wood that did not want to burn, was a sound Birch heard in his head for a long time after. It was not an accusation. It was just a sound. But he knew what it meant. He had given away the last coals in the house, and his family had woken to a cold stove in January. He lay awake that night, listening to Roscoe and Nettie breathe. Winifred slept beside him without moving the way she slept when she was too tired to do anything else. And Birch stared at the ceiling and understood with a clarity that he had not felt before that the problem was not the amount of wood he was burning. It was the fact that everything he burned vanished. Every scrap of heat he put into that room left again before morning. The cabin was not a home. It was a box with a fire inside it, and the moment the fire weakened, the box became the outdoors. He thought about the lime kiln, the wall still warm before sunrise, the heat that had gone nowhere. He began to see what he needed to do. Spring came the way it always did in Wyoming, reluctantly, and then all at once. The snow pulled back from the south, facing the hillsides first, and left behind ground that was soft and dark, and smelled like the earth had been holding its breath for months. By mid-April, the creek was running fast with melt, and the first green was showing along the banks. While the other men in Elorn Basin made their plans around timber, Birch rode south along the creek on a gray morning with no particular destination in mind. He was not looking for a sawmill. He was looking for something that most people in this country had long since stopped seeing value in. He found it on a low rise 1.5 miles south of the main settlement, an abandoned frontier fort, or what remained of one sitting on a gentle slope above Windahome Creek. The Army had built it decades earlier, used it briefly, and left it to the weather when the frontier moved west. What remained was the bones of the original structure walls of dressed stone that stood between 3 and 4 feet high, running roughly 24 feet by 38. The mortar in the joints weathered to a gray powder in most places and missing entirely in others. The stones themselves were limestone blocks cut and fitted by hands that had been dead for a generation. The walls had outlasted every building in the basin. Birch dismounted and walked the perimeters, slowly running his hand along the outer face. The stone was cold at this hour, and at this season cold the way all stone was cold in April. But it was solid. It had not moved. It had not rotted or warped or shifted in its foundation. It had simply stood there, absorbing season after season while the wooden buildings around it had come and gone. He was still standing at the southeast corner, looking at the way the morning light was beginning to touch the face of the south wall, when he became aware of someone nearby. An old man was working along the creek bank about 30 yards away, loading flat stones into a canvas sling one at a time. He was perhaps 70, lean and deliberate in the way that old men who have done physical work all their lives tend to be. Birch did not recognize him immediately but knew the type. A man who had worked stone. The way he lifted each piece, testing its weight and balance before he set it in the sling, gave him away. The old man noticed Birch at some point and straightened up and looked at him for a moment. He looked at the ruins. He looked back at Birch. Then he nodded once, a single slow movement that carried no particular greeting in it, and went back to loading stone. Birch did not know what to make of it. He was not sure the old man had meant anything at all. But the nod stayed with him, the way the warm wall had stayed with him years earlier before the sun came up. He bought the deed to the land the following morning, using the last of what he and Winifred had saved since coming to Wyoming. He did not consult her first. He rode home with the paper in his coat pocket and set it on the table in front of her when he came in the door. Winifred picked it up and read it carefully. The children were outside. Gravel was asleep near the cold stove. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when something important is happening in them. She set the paper down and looked at him. Her voice was steady and even. "All of it," she said. "All of it." She did not raise her voice, did not push back from the table, did not do any of the things that the moment might have called for. Instead, she looked at him for a long time with an expression that was not anger and not fear, but something that lived between the two. Then she asked a single question. "Are you certain?" Birch looked at his hands on the table. His knuckles were still cracked from the winter, just past the skin rough in the way it got when a man worked in cold and lime for months at a time. He thought about the kiln, about the wall before sunrise, about the way Gravel had spent all winter pressed against the iron stove because there was nowhere else in the house that held heat for longer than an hour. "Not certain," he said, "but more sure of this than anything else I know how to try." Winifred was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and began clearing the supper things from the table. That was how she said yes, not with words, with the decision to move forward into whatever came next. The work began the following week. While men all across a Lorne basin were measuring timber and sharpening crosscut saws, Birch spent his mornings at the old fort clearing brush and pulling decades of accumulated debris from inside the walls. Sage had rooted between the stones in several places and had to come out roots and all. Ground squirrels had built runs under the northeast corner and the soil there had loosened. He worked methodically section by section, the way he had learned to work when he was young, and time was the one thing a job required most. Winifred carried water from the creek in wooden buckets, a quarter-mile each trip. Roscoe collected the smaller stones that could be used to fill gaps in the existing courses. Nettie gathered dried grass for the mortar mix, bundling it into armloads and stacking it near the south wall. Nobody said much. There was an understanding in the family that could not be reduced to words. They were all in this together, and none of them fully knew where it was going, and the only thing to do was keep working. Gravel wandered the perimeter in wide loops throughout the day. By the second week, Birch had noticed a pattern. The dog tended to settle in the afternoon in one particular spot pressed against the base of the south wall, where the sun spent the most time. He would lie there for an hour or two, eyes half closed, not sleeping, but resting in the particular way dogs rest when they have found exactly what they were looking for. Birch never called him away from that spot. He just watched. One afternoon, he called Roscoe over to where he was working near that same wall. The afternoon sun had been on the south face since mid-morning, and the stone was holding it visibly now warm to the touch in the way stone gets when it has been receiving heat for several hours. He took the boy's hand and pressed it flat against the surface. "What do you feel?" he said. "Warm," Roscoe said. Birch said nothing more. He just let the boy hold his hand there. After a moment, Roscoe pulled his hand back and looked at the wall, then at the sky, calculating. The sun had moved past the midpoint of its arc by then. It was heading toward the western ridgeline. "The sun's been going down," Roscoe said slowly, "but the wall is still warm." Birch picked up his trowel and went back to work. That was enough. From the following morning onward, Roscoe did not need to be told to collect stone. He came to the site each day and found his own work to do and did it without being asked, moving around the perimeter with a purpose that he had not quite shown before. The boy had understood something, and understanding it had changed the quality of his presence at the work. Not everyone in a Lorne basin was watching with the same patience. It was sometime in the middle of August when 3 men stopped their horses on the road above the fort and looked down at Birch working in the heat of the afternoon. He heard them before he saw them, the creak of saddle leather and the sound of hooves on the dry ground settling into stillness. Prescott Dunn was the first one he recognized. Dunn was the most respected carpenter in the basin, a compact and deliberate man in his early 50s who had been building in Wyoming for nearly 30 years. When a family wanted a cabin that would last, they came to Dunn. When they wanted to know if a plan was sound, they came to Dunn. He did not give compliments easily, and he did not change his opinions often, which was part of why those opinions carried weight. Beside him was Tatum Grout, who owned the largest sawmill in the county. Grout was a big man with a businessman's way of looking at things, which was to say, he looked at everything in terms of what it cost and what it was worth, and whether those two numbers made sense together. He had good timber, plenty of it, and he was used to men coming to him when they needed to build. The third man was Thurlow Joss, who served as foreman on one of the larger homestead operations north of the settlement. Joss was younger than the other two, quick to laugh, and possessed of the particular gift that some men have for saying the unkind thing in a way that sounds almost like a joke. Dunn spoke first. His voice was not unkind, but it was direct, the way a man speaks when he believes he is doing someone a favor. "Stone belongs under a house," he said, "not around it. Those walls will pull the warmth right out of any fire you build before it has a chance to do anything for you." Grout leaned forward in his saddle. He had spent his savings on a pile of rubble when there was good sound timber sitting at the yard. Winter did not care about a man's plans. Joss looked around at the low walls, at the cleared interior, at the general appearance of a project that from the outside looked like nothing so much as a man spending his best building months moving the same stones from one place to another. A grin came over his face. "Looks like a cold box," he said, "like a man built himself a place to keep ice through the summer." He looked at the other two. "Coltrane's coal box. That is what I am going to call it." There was a short laugh from somewhere among the three of them. Birch had stopped working when the men stopped their horses. He stood now in the cleared interior of the fort with the afternoon sun on his back and listened to all of it without speaking. He was not a man who felt the need to answer every statement that was directed at him. He had learned that most arguments, if you let them sit long enough, answered themselves. He walked to the south wall and laid his palm flat against it. The stone was warm under his hand, carrying the afternoon heat the way it always did at this hour. He looked up at the three men on the road. "This wall keeps yesterday alive," he said. "Nothing more than that." He held their eyes for a moment, then turned and picked up his trowel and went back to work. The three men stayed a little longer. None of them said anything further. Eventually they rode on. Birch did not watch them go. He was thinking about the mortar joint in the northeast corner that still needed work before the day was done. There was a fourth man on that road, though not part of the group. Deputy Ransom Varnell had been riding back toward town from the direction of the old postal road and had slowed his horse without stopping when he saw the three men gathered above the fort. He was close enough to hear most of what passed between them. Varnell was the kind of man whose opinion shaped the opinion of others without ever quite announcing itself as an opinion. He did not laugh when Joss coined the name. He did not nod in agreement when Dunn laid out his objections. He simply took in what he saw and what he heard and rode on, and the expression on his face was the same at the end as it had been at the beginning. Birch did not notice him, but Ransom Varnell noticed it everything. The name spread through the basin faster than Birch had expected. By early September, most people who passed through the general store had heard some version of the story. Each time Joss told it, the details shifted a little. The walls were lower. The project was already failing. There was a version in which Birch planned to spend the winter underground like a badger. The laughter, Birch was told later, usually started before the story was even finished. Grout approached the situation from the practical side as he always did. He calculated out loud at the store counter what good lumber would have cost for a proper cabin on that parcel of ground, and what it would cost to do it right, once this experiment with old stone concluded the way everyone expected it to conclude. Dunn said less than either of them. He did not need to say much. A slow shake of the head from the most experienced builder in the basin communicated more than a speech. And people listened to Prescott Dunn. They always had. The pressure found its way home. One afternoon, Winifred returned from the trading post with flour and a length of cotton cloth, in the particular quietness that meant she had heard something she was not going to repeat. She put the supplies away. She started supper. She did not bring it up, and neither did Birch. Later that evening, after the children were in bed, she sat beside him near the stove with a piece of mending in her lap. She did not look up from her work when she spoke. "They made a wager," she said. "Joss and Grout, if the project fails before Christmas, you have to buy lumber from Tatum at whatever price he names." Birch looked at the fire. He had heard something similar from a man who had come by the site that afternoon, though he had not mentioned it to her. "We knew that," he said. Winifred set down the mending. For a moment, she looked at him directly, and her face had the quality of something that had been patient for a long time and was now asking a genuine question. "If you are wrong," she said quietly, "what happens to us?" The question sat between them in the warm room. Outside, the wind had picked up along the creek and was pushing against the cabin walls in the irregular way it did in September, finding the low spots, testing the boards. Birch listened to it for a moment. He thought about the lime kiln, about the wall before sunrise, about the way gravel had spent the worst nights of last winter pressed against iron because wood held nothing. Then winter will tell us before spring, he said. That is all I know how to say. It was not a reassurance. He knew it was not, and so did she. But it was honest, and between them, dear, when honest had always been worth more than comfortable. Winifred picked up her mending again. The fire cracked once and settled, and the house went quiet around them in the particular way that Wyoming houses go quiet in the fall, when the first cold nights have arrived and the long season everyone has been preparing for is no longer something in the future. The rain came without warning on a Tuesday night in late September. No thunder announced it. No wind pushed ahead of it. The clouds had been building since afternoon in a low gray mass that most men in the basin recognized as the kind of weather that did not make noise, only damage. By the time Birch banked the stove and carried the lamp upstairs, the first drops were already ticking against the roof. He woke before dawn to the sound of something that was not rain. It was silence. The particular silence that follows a long night of water when the ground has taken all it can hold and everything that was going to move has already moved. He dressed in the dark and went out before the children were awake. The northeast corner of the fort told him everything as soon as he reached the rise. A section of the lowest course had shifted outward, pushed by the water that had gathered against the base of the wall, where the ground sloped slightly inward. The fresh mortar he had laid 10 days ago had not yet fully cured, and the rain had found that weakness the way rain always finds whatever a builder is not yet ready to defend. 3 stones had moved. The joint above them had opened. A narrow crack ran upward through the newly repaired section like a signature. Birch crouched at the corner and looked at it for a long time without touching anything. Gravel came up beside him and lowered his nose to the wet ground near the base of the wall. The dog sniffed along the damaged section for a moment, then turned and walked to a different spot 20 feet away and laid down there instead. He did not look back at the corner. That was enough. Birch was still crouching at the damaged section when he heard a horse on the road above. Thurlow Joss pulled up and looked down at the fort with the particular expression of a man who has arrived at exactly the right moment to see exactly what he was hoping to see. He did not say anything for a moment. He just looked. Then he touched his hat brim and rode on toward town. By evening, Birch knew what the story would sound like at the general store. He had heard enough versions of other men's misfortunes travel through a Lorne basin to know how the sequence went. The truth would leave first. The embellishments would catch up before supper. He was still at the damaged corner when Prescott Dunn arrived the following morning. Dunn came alone and on foot, which meant he had walked from wherever he had tied his horse, which meant he had come to look and not to be seen looking. He crouched at the corner the way a man crouches when he is applying the full weight of his experience to something slowly and with care, and he studied the standing water and the shifted stones and the open joint for a long time without speaking. When he stood, his voice was measured and without pleasure. Water will do what cold finishes, he said. You can put those stones back, but if the drainage does not change, the first hard freeze will open it again from the inside. He was not wrong. Birch knew he was not wrong before the last word was out. That was the part that made it difficult to hear. Not the tone, which was not unkind. The accuracy. He did not argue. He did not explain himself. He looked at the damaged section, and then he began taking the stones out one at a time. Roscoe had followed him down to the site that morning and stood watching as his father dismantled what had taken weeks to build. The boy's face was careful in the way faces are careful when they are trying not to show what they are thinking. Are we going back to the old cabin? Roscoe said at last. Birch did not look up from the stone he was lifting. Not if I learn fast enough. It was not a reassurance. It was an accounting. A man telling a boy the exact terms of the situation. Roscoe was quiet for a moment, and then he picked up one of the stones that had fallen and carried it to the growing pile his father had started. He did not ask any more questions. The repair took the better part of a week, but it was not really a repair. Birch understood the distinction clearly. A repair would have been putting back what had failed. What he was doing was correcting the thinking that had allowed the failure to happen in the first place. He dug a new trench along the entire north face, deeper and wider than the original, and filled the bottom with crushed shale that would carry water away from the foundation rather than letting it collect. He adjusted the slope of the ground along the base of the wall with packed soil and stone, creating a fall of several inches over a distance of 4 feet. Then he changed the mortar. The exterior layer got more lime, which meant it would cure harder and shed water rather than absorbing it. The interior layer stayed softer and slightly more flexible so that it could move a small amount with the stone through the cycles of heating and cooling without cracking open. The difference between the two mixes was subtle. You would not have seen it from the road. But the wall would know eventually, and that was the only audience that mattered. Winifred watched him rebuilding the corner one evening after the children were already heading toward the house for supper. She had been carrying the last bucket of water up from the creek, and she set it down and looked at the work for a while. "Why not just fill in what washed out?" she said. Birch was pressing the new exterior mortar into a joint between two of the reset stones. He felt the mixture resist and then yield against the pressure of his thumb. "Because if the wall holds water, frost will split it from inside," he said. What washed out was the symptom, the slope was the problem. Winifred looked at the trench, at the new grade of the ground, at the subtle pitch that now directed water away from the base of the wall. She had an eye for work. She always had. She did not say anything more, but she picked up the water bucket and went to the house, and something in the way she carried it was different from how she had been carrying things lately. It was 4 days after the corner was finished that Cornelius Braddock appeared at the site. Birch had seen the man once before briefly at the creek on the day he first found the fort. He had not known his name then, and still did not know it when the old man came walking up the rise one afternoon and stopped near the southeast corner and looked at the work without saying anything. He was perhaps 70, with the deliberate economy of movement that belongs to men who have spent a lifetime doing work that punished wastefulness. His hands were the kind of hands that told you everything before he opened his mouth. Big-knuckled, scarred across the backs. The right thumb crooked slightly where it had healed wrong from some old break. He stood at the base of the south wall and ran one of those hands along the outer face, applying a small testing pressure to several of the stones in sequence. Not the pressure of a man checking for something he expected to find wrong. The pressure of a man recognizing something he had done himself. Birch watched him and said nothing. After a while, the old man sat down on a section of low wall near the southeast corner and looked at the interior of the fort and at the repaired northeast corner and at the fresh grade of the ground along the base of the north face. "I saw you the first time you came out here," Braddock said at last. His voice was the voice of a man who had not spoken to many people recently. Measured and a little rough at the edges. "I know," Birch said. The old man nodded. He took a leather satchel off his shoulder and set it on the wall beside him, but did not open it yet. "I built something like this once," he said. "Ohio, 1851. He said it the way a man says a year, when what he really means is a story attached to that year, and Birch understood that the story was coming and that he should let it come at its own pace. Braddock had been a stonemason in his younger years, working the limestone country of eastern Ohio, where the rock ran close to the surface, and good stone could be had for the work of quarrying it. He had built a house for his own family using the same principles Birch was working toward. Now thick walls, a heavy earthen roof, a hearth built directly into the north wall so that the stone would absorb the heat rather than send it up the chimney. The house had worked. Through 2 consecutive winters that had killed livestock across 3 counties, the family inside those walls had burned less than half the wood their neighbors burned and had stayed warmer doing it. By the second winter, people had started to notice. They came to look at the house. They asked questions. Some of them began to change the way they thought about what they were building. And then a man on the neighboring claims, a man who had been watching all of this with an expression Braddock had recognized too late as something other than curiosity, started a story. The story was that Braddock had used stone quarried from land that belonged to the church. There was no basis for it. The stone had come from his own property, and everyone who had worked with him knew it. But the man told the story persistently and with conviction. And in a small community in 1851, a persistent and convincing story did not need to be true to do its work. The community turned, not all at once. Gradually, the way trust erodes, which is to say invisibly until the day you step on what you thought was solid ground and find nothing under it. Within a season, Braddock was selling the property and leaving the county. He paused and looked at the fort walls for a moment. "I did not speak up when I saw you at this place," he said. Not because I did not believe in what you were doing. He looked at Birch directly. Because I know what happens when people start to believe. Birch said nothing. The afternoon light was going long and orange across the south face of the wall behind him. Braddock reached into the leather satchel and brought out a small notebook, old and worn at the spine. The cover stained with something that might have been lime or might have been time. He held it for a moment before he set it down on the wall beside him and pushed it toward Birch. Everything I learned about how to do it right is in there, Braddock said. The mortar ratios, the roof loads, the orientation of the hearth. He stood up, settling the empty satchel back over his shoulder. Do not thank me. Make it stand. He walked back down the rise toward the creek without looking back, and Birch stood in the late afternoon light, holding a dead man's notebook and thinking about Ohio. That night, he sat at the table with the notebook open in front of him, while Winifred cleared the supper things around him. She paused at one point and looked at what he was reading. Who is he? She said. A man who built this same thing 30 years ago, Birch said. In Ohio. Winifred sat down across from him. What happened to it? Birch told her. All of it. The house that had worked, the neighbor, the story about the church land, the community turning, Braddock selling and leaving. Winifred was quiet for a while. Then she said, he was run off because people believed in his work. Birch looked at her. That is when it became dangerous, he said. They sat with that for a moment. Gravel was stretched out near the wall beneath the window, which was where the dog had been sleeping lately, when the nights were cold, not beside the stove, but against the wall drawn by something Birch had not instructed him toward. Outside, the first real cold of October was settling over the basin. The season was narrowing. The work was not finished, but the direction of it had changed. Birch looked at the notebook and at his wife across the table and at the dog against the wall, and he understood that the next part of the winter was going to test something harder than stone. October moved through the basin the way it always did in Wyoming, when the year had made up its mind. The aspens along the creek went yellow almost overnight, and then the wind stripped them, and they were burned, and the ridge lines turned from green to rust to brown in the space of 2 weeks. The mornings arrived harder each day, the ground ringing slightly under a boot heel where it had been soft the week before. Birch built the roof. This was the stage of the project that drew more comment than anything that had come before it, because the roof was visible from the road, and because it looked like nothing any sensible person would put on a house. He laid heavy cottonwood beams across the top of the walls, then a lattice of dried sage branches, then dried prairie grass, laid thick, and finally sod cut from the hillside in sections roughly the size of a man's torso, each one heavy and awkward, and requiring 2 people to lift into position. The finished result looked less like a building than like a section of hillside that had decided to stay where it was while everything around it changed. From the road, it was barely distinguishable from the landscape, a low, dark shape against the slope, the roof grass beginning to fade to the same color as the ground around it. Joss told people at the store that Birch Coltrane had built a family tomb. The name got around before the week was out. Winifred heard it on a Friday when she went to collect mail. She came home without mentioning it. Birch knew she had heard something by the particular way she set the mail on the table and went directly to the kitchen without pausing. He did not ask, she did not offer. They had developed an efficient system for managing what the town thought of them, which was to say they had agreed without ever discussing it to keep it outside the house. It was on a gray afternoon in late October that Deputy Ransom Varnell came to the site. He tied his horse at the bottom of the rise and walked up alone without the particular purposefulness that would have suggested an official visit. He looked at the finished walls and the new roof for a while before he said anything. When he spoke, his voice had the quality that Varnell's voice always had, of a man who had thought about what he was going to say before he arrived. Birch, he said, I am not here to tell you that you are wrong. I want to be clear about that first. He looked at the sod roof, at the depth of it, at the way the walls met the overhang. But there are people in this valley who are not going to be quiet if that roof comes down in a heavy snow, he continued. And if it comes down with your family inside it, I will not be able to stand between you and what they say afterward. Not because I would not want to, because the situation would not leave me anywhere to stand. He turned and looked at Birch directly. You understand what I am telling you. Birch had stopped working when Varnell started speaking. He stood now with the trowel in one hand and looked at the deputy and understood what it had probably cost the man to come out here and say this, and what it would cost him not to say it. I hear you, Birch said. You are right to worry, but the roof load has been calculated. Varnell looked at the roof again. He did not ask who had done the calculating. He seemed to understand that an answer would either reassure him or trouble him further, and that he was not sure he wanted either right now. I hope you are right, he said. That was all. He walked back down to his horse and rode toward town. That evening, Winifred asked him how the conversation had gone, because word traveled in the basin, and she had known Varnell was coming before he arrived. Birch told her what had been said. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, the roof load, did you actually calculate it? Birch looked at her. Braddock calculated it in the notebook. Winifred said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the notebook where it sat on the shelf near the window, worn and stained, and 30 years old. You trust that notebook, she said finally. I trust the hands that wrote it, Birch said. Winifred turned back to what she had been doing. She did not say anything more. But something in the quality of her silence had shifted slightly, and Birch noticed it, though he could not have said exactly what had changed. Birch spent 2 more weeks finishing the interior. The hearth was the part he thought about most carefully. In most homes in the basin, the stove stood free in the room, radiating heat in all directions and sending a considerable portion of it up the flue. Birch built his hearth directly against the north wall, the coldest wall, the wall that received the least sun and gave the most ground to winter. He wanted every fire he built to feed the stone directly. He wanted the north wall to be a reservoir for the heat he generated, holding it and releasing it through the night hours when the fire was low. The hearthstone was a single piece of limestone that weighed close to 300 pounds. Roscoe helped him move it into position on a makeshift sled of pine poles. It took the better part of a morning and left both of them silent with effort at the end of it. But when it was in place and the surrounding stonework was mortared and set, the hearth looked like it had been built into the wall from the beginning, which was exactly what Birch wanted people to think when they saw it. Not an addition, a part of the structure. He mounted 2 thermometers before the family moved in, one near the door, one on the north wall beside the hearth. A small notebook went onto the shelf above the second thermometer, and each evening after the children were in bed, he made his entries. Temperature at sunset, temperature before dawn, the amount of wood that had gone into the fire that day, how long the coals still glowed under the ash when he checked them in the morning, and where Gravel slept. Winifred saw the notation about the dog on the 3rd night and looked at him over the open notebook. You are keeping records of the dog now. Birch set the pen down. A dog does not flatter a wall. She looked at him for a moment the way she occasionally looked at him when she was deciding whether to continue with something. Then she turned and went back to her mending. 3 weeks into November, the numbers had developed a pattern. The outside temperature had dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit on several nights. On those mornings, the interior of the stone house had held above 48 degrees in every recorded instance. The fire had burned down to coals well before midnight on most nights, and the temperature inside had declined slowly and evenly through the dark hours rather than collapsing the way it had in the old cabin when the fire went low. The water bucket on the north side of the room and the spot where it had always frozen before dawn in the old cabin remained clear. But the detail that held Birch's attention most was the dog. Gravel had begun sleeping away from the hearth, not far away, but measurably, recordably away from it, stretched out on the packed earth floor nearer the north, in a position that made no obvious sense given that the fire was 5 feet closer in the other direction. Birch wrote it down each night. The dog's nose pointed toward the hearth. The rest of him pointed toward the wall. Gravel had found the balance point, the place where the radiated heat from the fire and the stored heat returning from the stone met and equalized, and had chosen that place the way animals choose things, without deliberation and without error. One evening, Winifred sat down beside him at the table after the entries were made and read back through the last several nights without asking permission. She turned pages slowly, stopped at one of the temperature readings, turned another page. Then she reached for the pen. She uncapped it and wrote one line at the bottom of that night's entry in her careful, even hand, and capped the pen and set it back where she had found it. Birch read what she had written. Gravel moved to the north wall again. 3rd night in a row. He did not say anything. He closed the notebook and set it on the shelf. But from that night on, when he sat making his entries, there was a quality to the work that had not been there before, a sense that the evidence was no longer entirely his to collect alone. November hardened toward December, and the conversations in the basin shifted in the way they always shifted when winter had been in the territory long enough to make itself real. At the general store, the talk was about firewood, about frozen water pipes and frozen creek crossings, about the price of lamp oil, and the quality of the repairs men had made to their roofs in September. Thurlow Joss continued to find ways to work Coltrane's coal box into the conversation at the store. The story had a long life because it was amusing and because the winter had not yet delivered a verdict, and the outcome was still genuinely uncertain in the minds of most people who followed it. Prescott Dunn said less. He had said his piece at the fort back in August, and he was not a man who repeated himself. But Birch knew through the particular kind of intelligence that travels through a small community without anyone carrying it deliberately that Dunn had been approached by Joss sometime in early November. Joss had wanted Dunn to put his name to a written concern delivered to the basin's informal governing committee about the structural safety of the Coltrane roof. Dunn had refused. He had not told Birch about the refusal. He had simply declined and gone about his work. It was Deputy Ransom Varnell who brought it to Birch's attention stopping at the site one morning on his rounds. He told you about it because he wanted you to know Dunn had refused, Winifred said that evening. Birch thought about that. Yes, Winifred said, that is not the same as Dunn supporting you. I know. She folded the shirt she had been working on. But it is not nothing either. No, Birch said, it is not nothing. 2 days later, Varnell found Joss at the store and said what he had to say in front of enough people that it would travel. He said that the valley had buried enough of its people without help from anyone's opinion, and that a man's right to build on his own land was not something that changed because the design was unusual. He said it without anger in the even tone of a man stating something he had thought about carefully and arrived at from principle. Joss did not have an adequate answer. The room heard the absence of one. That night, Prescott Dunn sat alone in his cabin, with the fire going and the wind finding every small imperfection in the walls that 30 years of Wyoming winters had opened up, and he thought about a question he had been carrying for weeks without quite admitting he was carrying it. He was the best builder in the Elorn Basin, and he knew it, and he had always known it. The knowing of it was not vanity, it was fact. And the question that was troubling him now, working at the edges of his certainty, the way cold worked at the edges of a joint, was the question of what it meant if a man who had never built a cabin in his life had found something that 3 decades of careful woodworking had never looked for. He did not sleep well. December arrived the way Decembers arrived in Wyoming, not as a date on the calendar, but as a physical event. The temperature fell sharply in the last week of the month, and the sky turned a pale iron color that men in the basin recognized as the precursor to something serious. Animals knew it before people did, as they always do. The cattle bunched in the low ground and stood with their backs to the north. Dogs that had been sleeping outside moved to the sheltered side of buildings. The creek slowed and then stilled along its edges. On the last day of the month, the Arctic front that had been building over the Canadian plains for a week crossed into Wyoming. Within 12 hours, the temperature at the old postal station north of the basin read 34 below zero. By the following morning, it had dropped to 38 below. Those numbers traveled through the valley faster than any other news that winter. And when they arrived, the laughter about the coal box stopped. It stopped in the middle of sentences. People heard the numbers and looked at each other, and then looked at their firewood supply, and did not think about Birch Coltrane and his stone house for the rest of that day, because they had enough of their own situation to think about. The verdict that everyone in the basin had been waiting for one way or the other had just walked in the door. The Arctic front did not announce itself with drama. It simply arrived the way the worst things arrive, quietly and completely, until there was no part of the world outside that it had not touched. Birch was awake before dawn on the 5th day of the cold. He had been waking at that hour for weeks now, not from discomfort, but from habit. The old habit of a man who had spent too many winters listening for the sound of a fire going low. He dressed in the dark and crossed to the north wall where the thermometer hung beside the hearth. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 36 below zero. Inside the stone house, the mercury held at 52 degrees. He stood there for a moment with the lamp held close to the glass, reading the number twice to be certain. The fire had burned down to a deep bed of coals sometime around midnight. He had not touched it since. The room was dim and still, and the air did not move anywhere in it, not near the floor, not near the ceiling, not in the corners. There were no corners in this house where winter had found a foothold. He walked to the water bucket on the far side of the room, the one he placed each evening as far from the hearth as the space allowed. He held the lamp over it. The surface was clear. He looked at the butter dish on the shelf, firm, not hard. He looked at Gravel stretched along the north wall with his eyes half open, watching Birch move through the room with the mild interest of an animal that has found its place and sees no reason to leave it. He looked at the firewood stacked against the east wall. There was more of it than there should have been at this point in the cold snap of this severity. More than he had calculated needing. Winifred was awake. He had not heard her move, but she was sitting up in the bed across the room, watching him make his circuit of the space with the lamp. She had the particular stillness of someone who has been awake for a while and has been thinking. He looked at her. She looked at the woodpile. Then she reached down from the bed, picked up one of the pieces of wood she had set out the night before to add to the fire in the morning, and placed it back on top of the stack. She did not say a word. Birch set the lamp down on the table and sat in the chair beside it. He opened the notebook and wrote the number from the thermometer. He wrote the condition of the coals. He wrote the water. He wrote the butter. He wrote where Gravel was sleeping. Then he sat for a while in the quiet of the house and listened to the wind work against the outside of the walls and find nothing. Prescott Dunn lost a horse on the 5th night of the cold front. The animal had been restless for 2 days, disturbed by the confinement and the sustained cold, and sometime in the darkness it had put its shoulder against a section of fence that the frost had worked loose from its posts and had walked out into the white. Dunn discovered the gap at first light. He stood at the broken fence and looked at the tracks already blurring in the wind-driven snow and made the decision that a man makes when an animal is worth more than his own comfort, which is to say he saddled up and went after it. The cold at that hour was not the kind of cold that announces itself gradually. It arrived at every exposed piece of skin simultaneously and with conviction. Dunn knew how to move in it. He kept his face down and his hands inside his coat as much as he could, and he followed the trail south along the creek bank where the horse had gone looking for the shelter of the cottonwoods. The trail curved away from the creek after a quarter mile and climbed toward the low rise above Windahome. The wind was coming straight from the north, and it hit him full in the face when he turned that direction, and he dropped his head and pushed into it and kept moving because stopping was not a useful option. He had not been thinking about where he was going. He had been thinking about the horse. So when his boot came down on uncertain ground and he threw his hand out to catch himself, he was not prepared for what his hand found. He was against the south wall of Birch Coltrane's stone house. He had come up the rise without realizing it, following the horse's trail that had angled toward the structure, perhaps drawn to it by the same instinct that drew animals to shelter. His bare hand was pressed flat against the stone. Dunn did not move. At 36 below zero, the things that cold does to exposed skin happen quickly and without mercy. He knew what he should be feeling. He had felt it before on other bad mornings, on other winters, when he had been careless for half a minute. The stone should have been conducting the cold directly into his palm, pulling the heat out of his hand with the efficiency of a material that had been sitting in that temperature for 5 days. That was not what was happening. The wall was not warm. He was clear-eyed enough to know that it was not warm in any ordinary sense. But the savage draw he expected, the immediate deep ache of heat leaving flesh against frozen stone, was not there. Something remained in the rock. Some reserve that 5 days at the bottom of a Wyoming winter had not been able to exhaust. The wall was giving something back. Not much, but enough to tell him that it had been receiving something for a long time, from a source that had been quiet for hours. Dunn stood at the south wall of that house for almost a full minute in the middle of a 36 below zero morning and did not move. 30 years of building in this country reorganized themselves inside him. Not loudly, not all at once, but with the quiet inevitability of something that cannot be stopped once it has started. He was not a man who came to conclusions carelessly. He was not a man who changed his mind because someone had argued him into it. But he was, underneath everything else, a man who trusted what his hands told him. It was the foundation of everything he had ever built. His hand was telling him something he had spent months refusing to hear. He walked to the door and knocked. When Birch opened it, Dunn noticed immediately what was not there. There was no rush of overheated air, no wave of stove-fed warmth pouring out past him, the way it poured out of every other building he had entered in the past 5 days. That desperate blast that told you the fire inside was working at its absolute limit just to keep the occupants from suffering. The air that came through the door was simply steady, unhurried, the same from floor to ceiling. He stepped inside. Roscoe was on the floor near the table working something with his hands, a piece of leather he appeared to be mending. Nettie was asleep under a wool blanket on the sleeping shelf, her face relaxed and without the tight economy of expression that children get when they are enduring cold. Winifred was at the table with bread and a knife, her movements easy, her sleeves not pulled down over her hands. Gravel lifted his head from the north wall and looked at Dunn with calm yellow eyes and put his head back down. Dunn's eyes moved to the water bucket on the far side of the room, clear surface, then to the wood pile. He looked at it for a long moment, calculating the way a man calculates who has been feeding fires for a week and knows exactly what this kind of cold should have consumed. How much wood, he said. Birch said nothing. He took the notebook from the shelf and held it out. Dunn took it and read. He read slowly, going back to reread entries, moving through the temperature records and the fuel records with the thoroughness of a man who is not looking to confirm what he believes but is genuinely trying to understand what the numbers mean. He stopped at one entry and read it twice. It was in a different hand than the others, smaller and more even. He looked up at Winifred, who had not stopped working while he read. She did not look back at him. He turned another page, and another. When he finally lowered the notebook, his face had the quality that faces have when an argument has ended without anyone winning it, which is the only way the important arguments ever end. I was wrong, he said. He was not speaking to Birch particularly. He was speaking to the room, to the steady air of it, to the dog against the wall and the clear water and the wood pile that should not have been that full. Birch said stone does not work against a fire. It works on a different schedule. Dunn set the notebook on the table. He looked at Roscoe, who had stopped pretending to work on the leather and was watching all of this with the open attention of a boy who knows he is seeing something he will not forget. He looked at the boy for a moment. Do you know why the dog sleeps there instead of beside the fire, Dunn said. Roscoe did not look at his father. He looked at Dunn directly, and there was nothing tentative in his voice. Because the wall gives back what the fire gave it, the boy said. The dog found the place where both of them meet. Dunn looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he looked at Birch, and something in the look acknowledged what it meant to have raised a child who understood what most grown men in this valley did not. I want to bring my own thermometer tomorrow, Dunn said. I need to see the numbers myself. Birch said, I have already measured, but you should measure again. A man needs to see a thing himself. Dunn stayed another 10 minutes asking questions that were not challenges, but genuine inquiries. The questions of a craftsman trying to understand a technique he had not encountered before. Birch answered each one without elaboration, giving him only what the question required. When Dunn left, the wind took him immediately, and he walked back into it with his head down, and he did not find the horse until an hour later, standing in a hollow 200 yards east of the creek. The front broke on the 7th day. The wind dropped first in the afternoon, going from a sustained assault to an intermittent one to something that could almost be called still. The temperature began to rise slowly and without drama, the way it always rose after these fronts, as if the cold were reconsidering its position. By the following morning, the worst of it had moved east, and what remained was simply winter, ordinary Wyoming winter, which was cold enough but felt almost gentle after what had come before. People came out of their houses and looked at what the week had done. The damage was familiar in its outline, if not its extent. Fence lines that needed resetting, roof sections that had moved under the snow load, water systems that had frozen in places they had not frozen before. One of the smaller homesteads north of the settlement had lost 2 cattle to the cold animals that had simply run out of the resources to keep going. Everyone had a story. That was how it always worked after a hard stretch. The stories came out at the store and along the road, and wherever 2 or 3 people stopped their horses long enough to talk. Who had burned how much wood? Who had gotten through it and who had not? Who had been prepared and who had discovered, as people discover every winter in this country, that what had been adequate in previous years was not adequate for this one. Dunn came back to the stone house the morning after the front broke, as he had said he would, with his own thermometer in his coat pocket. He measured the interior temperature at 3 points in the room and wrote the numbers in his own notebook. He measured again before he left. He did not comment on what the numbers said, but he wrote them down with the care of a man who intends to keep what he has written. 2 days later, at the general store, Thurlow Joss was the first to speak. He had positioned himself near the stove, the way he always did, and he had waited for the right moment, and when several of the men who had been part of the original conversation in August were present together, he made his move. Well, Joss said with the grin that had not changed since the summer. Looks like the cold box did not freeze solid after all. There were a few sounds from around the room. Not quite laughter, more the reflexive social acknowledgement that a familiar joke had been delivered. The moment had its own momentum, and it seemed to be heading in the direction that most such moments had headed over the past several months. Then Prescott Dunn walked in. He had been outside tying his horse, which was why he had not been there from the start. He came through the door with snow on his coat and looked around the room and read the situation in the way that men who pay attention read situations. He walked to the counter and set down the things he had come to buy, and then he turned around. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anything. He spoke in the same measured tone he used when he was telling a client something they needed to hear. Anyone who is planning to build on the north end of the valley next season should go out to Birch Coltrane's place before they put in their lumber order, he said. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when the person who speaks has the kind of authority that does not need volume to make itself felt. Tatum Grout, who was standing near the counter, said, "You are telling us that stone beats pine." Dunn looked at Grout for a moment. Then he looked out the window at the valley, still covered in the aftermath of the worst cold snap in recent memory, at the fence lines down, and the drifts piled against every structure that stood in the path of the north wind. "I am telling you that the cold does not care what I used to believe," he said. Nobody laughed after that. The room held the statement the way a room holds something that has changed its center of gravity. Men exchanged looks that were not the looks of amusement or dismissal, but the looks of people recalculating something they had assumed was settled. Joss said nothing more. Grout folded his arms and looked at the floor. The moment moved on, as moments do, into the next conversation, but it moved differently than it would have moved an hour earlier. Ransom Varnell had come in just behind Dunn and had heard the exchange from the doorway. He did not add to it. He walked to the counter and did his business and left. But on his way out, he passed close enough to Joss to make eye contact briefly, and the look he gave was the look of a man who considers a matter closed. Birch was not in the room. He did not know any of this had happened until Marvella Alcott came by the house 4 days later on the pretext of returning a tool she had borrowed in the fall. She sat at the table with Winifred and told them what had been said in the order it had been said, while Birch listened from where he was working near the hearth. When she finished, Winifred poured more coffee without comment. Birch set down his work and looked at the north wall for a moment. He thought about Braddock, about Ohio and the community that had turned, and the 30 years that had passed between that turning and a cold morning at the creek when an old man had handed over a worn notebook and asked for nothing in return. He was glad that Braddock had not been in the store that day to hear what was said. He was glad for reasons he could not have fully articulated, except that it seemed to him that some debts were too old to be settled by a single conversation in a room the debtor had not even been present to witness. He would need to tell Braddock himself. Cornelius Braddock received the news the way he received most things, sitting on the section of low wall near the southeast corner of the fort, where he had sat in the fall looking at the work rather than at the person speaking to it. Birch told him what Dunn had said at the store, told him about Varnell and about Joss's silence and about the way the room had gone quiet. Braddock listened without interrupting. When Birch finished, the old man was quiet for a while. "Dunn is a good builder," Braddock said at last. "Always was. A good builder does not stay wrong once the evidence is in front of him. That is the difference between a craftsman and a man who only thinks he is one." He looked at the walls that had been standing since the army left them and had been repaired and improved and made into something new by a man who understood what they were capable of. "Ohio took 30 years to get to this point," Braddock said. "You did it in one winter." He looked at Birch. "That is not luck. That is because you did not build it alone." Birch understood what he meant. Not just Winifred, not just Roscoe and Nettie. The notebook. The work of a man who had learned the same lessons in a different valley, in a different decade, and had written them down and waited for the right moment to pass them on. Spring came to Elorn Basin the way it always came from the south-facing slopes. First, the snow pulling back in uneven lines to reveal ground that was dark and wet and full of the compressed energy of everything that had been waiting under the cold. The creek ran fast and loud for 2 weeks and then settled back into its ordinary voice. The first green appeared along the banks in the last week of March. People rebuilt what winter had damaged and began planning what they would build next. The conversations at the store changed in the gradual way that conversations change in small communities when a piece of information has been absorbed without anyone formally acknowledging the absorption. Men who had spent the winter burning twice the wood they expected to burn began asking questions. Not about birch specifically, about stone, about the way certain buildings seemed to hold their heat differently from others, about what made the difference between a wall that worked with a fire and a wall that simply let the fire's effort escape. Dunn answered some of those questions himself, which was the part that surprised people most. He did not abandon timber construction. He was too good at it and too honest about what it could do well. But he began talking to clients about how stone and wood could work together, about the parts of a structure where each material earned its place, about the difference between building something that performed